The alien settlers stood on the edge of the new camp laughing as the lone human hammered wooden beams into the hard ground, their tall silver domes already rising behind them with smooth walls and shining surfaces that looked unbreakable. Yet the human ignored their laughter and kept working with steady hands and patient movements, every strike of his hammer echoing across the dusty plain. They whispered among themselves that the strange shelter he built was weak, that looked like something from a forgotten age, something that belonged to the past, and not to this new world. One alien with bright scales on his head leaned close to another and said the human must have gone mad, because no one in their right mind would trust such fragile beams against the wild nature of this planet. The others laughed louder, their voices carrying in the dry air. The human did not answer. He did not even raise his head. He drove another beam into the soil, tied it with rope, layered it with heavy cloth, and pressed sand around the base as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Yet his silence only fueled the aliens' mockery, because to them silence was weakness, silence was shame, silence was proof that he knew his shelter was foolish. Still the human kept building, his face calm, his eyes sharp, every movement full of purpose. The hammer rang again and again, wood against stone, rope against grain, cloth against sand, and slowly the shape of a sturdy shelter began to form. Though it looked nothing like the proud domes of the settlers, the aliens shook their heads and told each other that the storm winds of this planet would tear such a shack apart in a single hour, that when the first trial came, the human would run to them, begging for safety in their shining domes. But the human never looked at their domes, he never measured his work against theirs. He only glanced once at the horizon, a long, slow look that none of the aliens noticed at first, his eyes fixed on the faraway line where sky met land, a line where heat shimmered and shadows moved like restless beasts. Then he turned back and kept working, as if time itself was his enemy, and every moment had to be used wisely. The aliens grew restless, because laughter alone did not bring comfort now. Something about the human's focus began to make them uneasy. They asked each other why he would work so hard if he truly believed his shelter was weak. One muttered that perhaps humans were simply stubborn creatures. Another said maybe he built it for comfort, for some strange human ritual. But deep inside, a small seed of doubt began to grow. And doubt was something they did not want to feel. One young alien with bright silver eyes finally stepped closer, his voice sharp as he shouted that the human was wasting his time, that no structure made of wood and cloth could stand against the storms of this world. He waved his arms at the domes behind him, smooth and shining with advanced shields and reinforced plating, and told the human to look at true strength, to see the difference between primitive labor and real protection. The others cheered and laughed again, their pride rising like a fire in the dry air. The human only tightened a rope around a beam, his hands slow and careful, then pressed the knot with his weight until it held firm. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He let their words pass like the wind, and the more silent he stayed, the more uneasy they became, because in his silence there was no fear, only patience, only certainty, and they could not understand it. The sun burned higher, the air grew hot, and still he worked, sweat running down his face, dust clinging to his arms. Yet his movements never slowed, never faltered. The aliens grew bored of their own laughter. Yet they stayed because something in them wanted to see this strange human fail, to watch the moment when the fragile beams would fall. They told themselves it would be soon, perhaps before nightfall, perhaps with the first strong wind that swept across the plain. The human finally paused, not to rest, but to lift his head once more toward the horizon. His eyes narrowed, his breath deep, and for a moment it seemed as if he listened to something the others could not hear. The aliens followed his gaze, but saw nothing except empty land stretching forever, a dull sky, and a shimmer of heat. They laughed again, though less certain now, and said he was searching for ghosts, for invisible enemies that did not exist. But the human knew better. His silence was not madness. It was memory. It was knowledge earned from storms far worse than any the aliens had imagined, storms that had once buried entire cities on other worlds, storms that did not care for shields or metal, storms that only respected design, patience, and roots sunk deep into the earth. His hands touched the beams again, and he drove another stake into the sand with a sharp strike that rang louder than before. The aliens felt a chill run through them, though the air was still hot, because the human shelter was rising, its frame already solid, its walls already thick with layers that bent but did not break. It was not beautiful, not smooth, not shining, but it stood like something that belonged, something that would endure, and that thought unsettled them. They muttered again, louder this time, forcing laughter back into their voices, telling themselves that a strange design was still useless, that when the real test came it would crumble. Yet their words carried less strength now, more doubt, and their eyes kept drifting back to the horizon without knowing why. Far away, beyond the shimmer, beyond the heat, a shadow began to spread, a dark wall of dust rising slowly but surely, a beast awakening from sleep, climbing higher with every breath of wind, unseen by alien eyes, ignored by their pride, but noticed by one man who stood alone with his shelter, his hammer, and his silence, the only one who truly understood what was coming. The morning light spread across the alien camp in soft waves, yet the air carried a strange weight that none of the settlers could explain, a dryness sharper than before, a taste of dust on their tongues. The ground itself seemed to whisper as the wind crawled faster across the barren land. Yet they did not see danger. They only trusted their technology, their silver domes shining with power and control. But one figure did not share their confidence. The lone human who still worked around his wooden shelter. He pressed heavy stones into the corners, tightened ropes that stretched deep into the soil, and layered cloth upon cloth so that each seam bent but never tore. His arms moved with the rhythm of memory, not of guessing. His eyes kept shifting back to the horizon as if every passing hour was a countdown he alone could hear. And though he never spoke a single warning, his actions were a message louder than words. But the aliens refused to hear. Some of them began to gather again, watching the strange ritual of labor, their voices filled with pride and disbelief. One said the human was wasting precious strength. Another said the wooden shelter would collapse at the first test. Yet their words were thinner now, for deep inside they had begun to wonder why he built with such care, why his hands never shook, why his face never showed doubt. Their laughter tried to cover fear, but fear was a seed growing quietly among them. The wind lifted more dust from the ground. A faint haze spread over the horizon, but the aliens called it nothing, only a small wave of the planet's usual air. Yet the human stopped for a moment, pressing one hand into the soil as if to feel the heartbeat of the world, his gaze long and steady. Then he returned to his work with even greater speed, fastening beams together, sinking stakes deeper, his silence like a wall they could not break. By midday the sun burned high, yet its heat felt strange, not only hot but heavy, pressing against skin and armor alike. The aliens retreated into the shadows of their domes, where cooling vents hummed softly. Yet the human stayed outside, sweat running down his body, his hammer ringing, his ropes tightening, his shelter rising higher like a stubborn tree in an empty field. And some of the aliens whispered that perhaps he was preparing for something they did not see, though they quickly silenced themselves when others looked at them with sharp eyes. One elder alien with scales dull from age approached the human and asked why he wasted his labor, why he refused the safety of advanced domes, why he trusted wood and cloth instead of metal and shield. But the human gave no answer. He only pointed once to the faraway horizon where the haze had grown darker. Then he turned away and drove another stake into the ground. The elder scoffed and walked back shaking his head. Yet his eyes kept turning back toward that darkening line even after he rejoined his people. The day stretched longer, and the signs became harder to ignore. Birds that usually circled the plains vanished into silence. Small crawling beasts dug deep into the sand and did not rise again. The wind now whistled instead of whispering, and fine grains of dust bit into alien skin whenever they stepped outside. Some began to check the seals on their domes, adjusting panels and shields, though they told themselves it was only routine. Yet every movement betrayed unease, every glance betrayed doubt. Still the human worked, his shelter now almost complete, its frame bound together like muscle and bone, its walls layered like skin and armor, And though it looked simple, it stood with a strength that even the proud aliens could not ignore. They asked themselves why it had not toppled yet, why the wind bent around it instead of through it. And though they would not admit it, some felt safer just standing near it. As the sun began to sink, the horizon darkened further. No longer a faint haze, but a looming shadow, a wall that seemed to crawl higher each moment. And for the first time, the laughter of the settlers died completely, their voices quiet as they watched the distance, their eyes narrowing with unease. Yet still they told themselves it was nothing, perhaps a harmless weather change, perhaps only the sky playing tricks. They clung to denial like a rope because to accept the truth would mean admitting the human had seen it first. The human stood at the edge of his shelter now, his hands resting on the final beam, his eyes locked on the horizon. The wind tugged at his clothes. The air smelled of dust and storm, and though the aliens could not hear it, he seemed to listen to a sound deep inside the earth, a sound of something vast approaching. He whispered words too low for them to understand, but his tone was heavy, final, like a warning given not with fear, but with certainty. That night the aliens gathered in their domes, sealing doors and trusting their walls. Lights flickered inside, shields shimmered, vents closed tight. They told themselves they were safe. They told themselves storms meant nothing against their science. Yet none of them slept easily. Shadows moved in their dreams, whispers of sand scratching at their doors, and the silence outside pressed hard against their minds. The human sat alone inside his shelter, lantern dim, ropes pulled tight, stones steady in their places. The walls breathed with the wind yet did not break. His eyes remained open, fixed on the shaking horizon, his breath deep, his mind steady. For he knew the storm was no dream. It was a beast already awake, moving closer with each hour. And far away across the plain, the wall of dust rose higher, swallowing the horizon, rolling forward like an endless tide, its voice still faint but growing, a low rumble that the aliens still could not hear. But the human heard it as clearly as a drumbeat. And when he whispered again, it was not to warn, but to confirm what he had always known. It is coming. The dawn came with no warmth, though the sun rose above the horizon. The light was swallowed by a thick haze that blurred the sky and turned the land into a dull sea of shifting colors. The alien settlers woke to find their domes covered in a thin layer of dust that had crept into every crack and every seam, though their machines brushed it away. Quickly the taste of sand lingered in their mouths like a bitter warning. The human stood outside his shelter as the new day began, his eyes narrow, his face calm, his hands tightening the last ropes on the frame. The shelter looked stronger than before, the beams bound together. Like a living creature, the cloth pressed flat against the wood, the stones heavy at the base, holding it firm against the pull of the wind. He touched each part with care, as if confirming its readiness. Then he lifted his head toward the horizon where the dark wall of dust was no longer hidden, but now visible even to alien eyes. The settlers gathered near their domes, muttering among themselves. Some said the haze was nothing, only a passing storm that would fade in hours. Others said the human had built his strange shack in fear. It would soon collapse when the real winds arrived, but their voices carried less pride than before, for the sight of the horizon unsettled them. The sky looked wrong, the air carried a strange hum, as if the earth itself was alive and restless. One young alien with sharp blue eyes shouted across the camp that the human should abandon his wooden shell and join them in the safety of the domes. His voice loud and strong, yet edged with unease, he claimed the domes were built with knowledge far beyond human craft, with shields that no storm could break, with seals that no sand could pierce. He called the human foolish for wasting his energy on such a fragile design, but the human gave no reply. He only adjusted one rope, then turned to face the horizon once more. The wind began to rise, carrying with it more dust than before. Thin rivers of sand crawled across the ground, slipping into cracks, swirling around feet. The air grew heavy, making every breath taste of stone. The aliens adjusted the vents of their domes, sealing tighter as alarms blinked softly to warn of pressure shifts inside. Yet they told themselves it was nothing more than the planet's usual mood. They trusted the glow of their machines, even as the noise outside grew louder. The human stepped back from his shelter, now complete. He walked slowly around it, pressing each knot, each anchor, each stone, as if testing the bones of a beast that would soon face battle. Then he stood still, his back straight, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Some of the aliens stared at him in silence, wondering why his face showed no fear, why his shoulders carried calm, while their own hearts raced faster with every gust. One whispered that perhaps humans were strange because they had lived through storms far worse on other worlds. Another hissed that such thoughts were dangerous, for they gave respect where there should only be doubt. The first true warning struck without mercy. A violent gust of wind swept through the camp, tearing dust high into the air. It slammed against the domes with a force that made their frames groan. Metal panels vibrated, shields flared with sudden energy, and the settlers stumbled inside, their voices sharp with alarm. Though they tried to laugh, still claiming safety, their eyes betrayed fear as the ground shook beneath their feet. The human did not run. He placed one hand against the wall of his shelter, feeling the pressure pass through it. The beams bent, but held. The cloth flexed, but did not tear. The stones sank deeper into the earth as the shelter stood unmoved. He nodded once, as if satisfied, then sat near the entrance, waiting calm, as if he had expected the gust to come at that exact moment. The aliens peered through their dome windows, their faces pale against the glow of machines. They watched the human sitting outside as dust swirled around him like angry spirits. One said he was reckless, another said he was mad, but none could deny that his shelter still stood strong, even as sand scraped at its walls and wind clawed at its frame. Hours passed, and the haze grew thicker, swallowing the horizon until the world beyond the camp disappeared entirely. The settlers no longer laughed. They checked their seals again, their machines again, their shields again, repeating motions not from need, but from fear, for the sound of the storm was growing louder, a low roar in the distance, like the voice of something ancient and vast. The human finally rose. He tightened one last rope. He placed extra stones at the base. Then he looked once more at the horizon. Though it was gone beneath the wall of dust, his eyes still followed it, as if he could see through the storm itself. He spoke at last, his voice low, yet sharp enough to carry to those who listened. He said, "It is not here, yet this is only the breath before the beast comes." The aliens stared at him through the shimmering shields of their domes, his words heavy in their minds, though many pretended not to hear. One older alien whispered that if the human was right, then their domes might not hold. Another shouted back that their domes were built by science, not superstition, and that no storm could defeat them. Yet his hand shook as he sealed another vent. Night began to fall, yet the sky did not darken naturally. It was the dust that ate the light, leaving the camp in a strange red glow, as if fire burned behind the wall of sand. The settlers huddled inside their domes, unease growing into fear, while outside the human lit a single lantern inside his shelter, its light steady against the shadows. The storm not yet fully arrived, but already stronger than any they had known on this world. The final warning of the day came with a sound like thunder. The wind howled and threw itself against the camp domes, shook metal, screamed, alarms shrieked as power drained to keep shields alive. The settlers cried out, holding each other inside and praying their machines would hold. But when the fury passed, they looked out and saw the human shelter still standing calm and steady, its lantern glowing within like a quiet heart in the dark. And far beyond them, unseen, behind the wall of dust, the storm gathered its true strength, a beast waiting to strike, its roar still distant, but growing louder with every breath, while only one human sat ready, his shelter firm as silence, unbroken, his eyes steady on the darkness that approached. The night did not come quietly, for the wall of dust that had risen across the horizon finally reached the camp. And when it struck, it came like a beast with endless claws, tearing the land without mercy. The first gust roared with a scream, so sharp it bent metal and shook the ground. The domes shuddered under the weight of the storm, their polished silver shells groaning as if alive, their shields glowing with strained light. The settlers inside cried out as sand scraped against walls with a sound like knives grinding against stone. The wind poured across the plain with fury, lifting rivers of sand into the sky until nothing could be seen. The world vanished in a whirl of dust and noise. The air itself turned to poison filled with grains sharp enough to cut skin and blind eyes. The aliens huddled together inside their machines, their voices trembling as alarms screamed across every dome, warning of pressure breaches and shield strain. Yet they told themselves again and again that their science was strong, that no storm could overcome the power of their people. But outside in the chaos, the human shelter stood, its frame bending like a tree, but never breaking, its walls flexing with the rhythm of the wind, its ropes singing with tension as they held firm. The lantern inside glowed softly against the roaring dark, and the man within sat calm, his hands pressed to the wood, as if feeling the pulse of the storm itself, his eyes steady, his breath slow, for he had seen storms before, and he knew this was only the beginning. Inside the domes, fear spread quickly, for every crack of metal, every scream of wind shook their pride. One young alien shouted that the shields were weakening, another shouted that the vents were failing. Sparks burst from machines as sand clogged filters and shorted circuits. The leaders commanded calm, but their own voices wavered with unease, their eyes betraying the fear they tried to hide. One alien dared to glance through a narrow window into the storm, and what he saw froze his heart. The human shelter was still standing, not broken, not shattered, but alive against the storm's fury. It swayed, but did not fall, its walls shaking, yet holding strong, while their proud domes trembled under every blow. He cried out in disbelief, pointing to the light that still burned inside the small wooden hut, and the others turned their eyes to see, though most could not believe what stood before them. The storm grew stronger, each passing moment. Waves of sand slammed into the camp with force like hammers. Entire panels of metal bent inward. Alarms rose to a scream. Machines failed one after another. Seals burst open, letting in clouds of dust that stung eyes and burned lungs. The settlers scrambled to seal the gaps with their own hands, coughing, choking, praying to hold the storm away. Yet the beast outside cared nothing for their science, its rage endless, its strength merciless. Still the human shelter stood, anchored deep, its stones pressed firm, its ropes pulled tight, every piece built not to resist, but to bend with the storm's rhythm. And so it endured. What the aliens thought weak was in truth strong, because it knew how to move with the fury instead of against it. The man inside whispered words lost in the howl of the wind, words of patience, words of warning, words that no one else could hear. Hours passed, though time meant nothing inside the storm. The sky was gone, the land was gone. There was only red dust swirling endlessly and the sound of wind tearing everything it touched. The settlers grew weak, their machines failing, their hope slipping. With every alarm and every groan of metal, they began to ask each other, what if the human was right? What if his strange shelter was stronger than their domes? Yet fear silenced their voices and pride chained their hearts. Then came the moment of truth, when the strongest gust yet slammed into the camp, a wave so powerful it lifted sand like an ocean and threw it against the domes with thunderous force. One dome cracked, its shield collapsing in a flash of sparks, the walls bending inward until they split wide open, sand pouring inside like water. The settlers within screamed as they rushed for safety, some reaching the doors of other domes, others falling beneath the storm's fury. Through the raging dark, one alien shouted above the noise, get to the human shelter. If it is still standing, his voice desperate, filled with fear, and the others heard it, though none had wanted to speak such words before. Now the truth was clear. Their domes were failing, their science was failing, their pride was failing, and the only chance that remained stood within the wooden hut they had mocked. The human inside lifted his head, his eyes narrowing, as if he had heard their cries, though the storm swallowed all sound. He rose and pushed against the door, his shelter bending, but still steady, his lantern light spilling into the dust like a beacon in the endless night. The aliens who had once laughed now ran through the storm, their bodies torn by sand, their skin bleeding, their voices raw from the choking air. Yet they forced their way forward toward that single glow. The storm raged on around them, tearing at their bodies, pulling at their limbs, pushing them back at every step, but desperation gave them strength. They stumbled, they fell, they rose again, crawling through the sea of dust with eyes nearly blind and lungs burning. They pushed forward with the last of their strength, and when they thought they would be swallowed forever, the door of the human shelter opened wide. A strong hand reached out, pulling one inside, then another, until a small group collapsed onto the floor, coughing and shivering, their bodies shaking with pain, but their eyes wide with shock, for inside the shelter There was calm, no alarms, no sparks, no collapsing walls, only steady beams, steady ropes, steady light, and a man who stood tall against the fury outside. And still more aliens fought through the storm, their cries lost in the howl. But their movements, desperate their pride, shattered their faith in machines broken now. They sought the safety of the human shelter, the one they had doubted, the one they had mocked. Now, the only hope against the storm that would not end. The storm screamed across the plain with endless fury, the wind clawing at every surface, the sand cutting through metal like blades. The proud domes of the settlers split open one after another, their shining walls torn apart, their shields burning out with sparks and smoke. The aliens within cried out, their voices drowned in the roar. As they stumbled into the storm, their eyes stung, their lungs burned, their bodies torn by grains sharp as glass. Yet they had no choice, for their homes were falling, their machines failing, and death closing around them. They ran blind through the storm, each step a battle against the weight of the wind, their limbs heavy, their movements slow, as if the air itself fought to drag them down. One alien fell to his knees coughing as sand filled his mouth, but another pulled him up screaming through the dust that they must keep moving, for there was only one place left, one shelter left, the wooden shack of the human they had once mocked but now prayed was still standing. The human stood at the doorway of his shelter, his figure half hidden by swirling dust, yet the light of his lantern glowed behind him like a star in the endless night. He saw the shapes of the aliens crawling toward him, their bodies bent, their movements weak, yet their eyes filled with desperate hope. He stepped forward into the storm, his hand reaching out, his feet planted firm, as if the wind itself could not move him. One by one, he caught them, dragging them through the doorway into the calm inside. Inside the shelter, the storm was still heard, but only as a muffled growl outside. The walls bent, but did not break, the ropes strained, but did not snap, the stones held deep in the earth, and the aliens collapsed on the floor, coughing, spitting sand, their bodies trembling with shock, their minds stunned by the strange calm around them. They had expected to find chaos, they had expected to find weakness, but instead they found strength and safety in the place they had called foolish. The human gave them water from a small container, his hands steady, his face unreadable. He spoke only once, saying, "The storm has just begun," and his words fell heavy on their hearts, though they did not want to believe him, for already the fury outside felt like the end of all things. Yet he spoke with certainty, and that certainty shook them more than the storm itself. More figures staggered through the dust outside, their voices faint, their shapes nearly lost in the red haze. The human saw them. He tied a rope to the frame of his door, then wrapped it around his waist, and stepped fully into the storm, pulling one alien, then another, guiding them with steady strength. Though the wind tore at his clothes and sand cut his skin, he moved with the storm, not against it, using each gust as if he knew its rhythm. The aliens watched in awe as he returned again and again with survivors dragging them to safety. The shelter filled with more settlers, their once proud faces now pale, their eyes wide with fear. They looked around at the beams, the cloth, the stones, and could not understand why such simple things held when their advanced domes had failed. They whispered among themselves, some saying it must be chance, others saying it must be luck, yet none could deny that they were alive only because of the very structure they had mocked, only because of the human they had doubted. The storm grew louder, its roar like thunder rolling without end. The walls of the shelter shook, dust slipping through the seams, yet the structure held, bending, swaying, but never breaking. The human moved calmly, checking each rope, pressing each stone, tightening every knot, while the aliens huddled together, shivering with fear, each gust outside a reminder of how close they had come to death. One young alien finally asked the question that burned in all their minds. "How did you know? Why did you build this strange shelter while we trusted our domes?" The human looked at him, his eyes calm, his voice steady. And he said, "I have seen storms like this before on worlds far away, storms that swallowed cities, storms that crushed machines, storms that only those who built with patience survived. I knew it would come here." Too, the aliens fell silent, for his words carried truth heavy as stone. Outside, the storm unleashed a new wave of fury, a gust so strong it tore the last domes apart. Their walls ripped open, their frames scattered across the plain. The aliens inside screamed, but their voices were lost forever in the endless howl. Those inside the shelter pressed close to the walls, their hearts racing, yet the shelter stood anchored deep, moving with the storm instead of against it, its strength proven again and again with every strike of the wind. The human stood tall at the center, his presence like a pillar, as the aliens looked to him not as a fool, but as a leader. They whispered to each other that without him they would be dead, that his strange ways had saved them. When their science had failed, the truth settled heavy in their minds, pride broken, replaced by a new respect, though none yet spoke it aloud. Hours dragged on the storm, endless. The aliens drifted between fear and exhaustion, their bodies weak, their eyes closing. Yet each time they opened them, they saw the human still moving, still checking, still standing against the fury, and that sight gave them strength, gave them a spark of hope that maybe they would survive this long night. And outside, unseen in the endless sea of dust, more aliens still crawled across the plain, their voices lost, their bodies broken, yet their eyes fixed on the faint glow of the lantern within the shelter, the last light of hope in a world swallowed by the storm. The storm did not weaken as the night dragged on. Instead, it grew stronger each hour, the wind roaring like 1,000 beasts outside, the human shelter the ground, shaking with every wave of force, the air filled with endless dust that turned the world into a sea of choking red. The aliens huddled together inside, their minds still spinning from what they had seen, their bodies trembling, their hearts heavy with fear, while the human moved calmly, checking each beam, each rope, each stone, his hands steady, his eyes sharp, as if he had rehearsed this moment his whole life. The shelter bent with the storm, yet it did not break. It swayed and groaned like a tree in a hurricane, yet its strength came from its movement, not from rigid walls. The aliens began to understand this, though they could not yet admit it aloud. They had built domes that stood hard against the wind, and because of that the storm had shattered them. But the human had built something that bent and breathed, and so it lived through the fury while their machines had died. The hours passed slowly like chains dragging across the ground. Every gust outside was a scream, every impact a threat that sent fear crawling through alien veins. Yet inside the shelter, there was no collapse, no alarms, no flashing warnings, only the muffled sound of the storm pressing its rage against walls that refused to fall. The aliens looked at each other, whispering in low voices, wondering if the storm would ever end, wondering if they would live to see the sun again. One alien asked how long it would last, his voice thin and shaking. The human turned his eyes to him, his face calm, his voice steady, and said, "Storms like this do not end quickly. They last until the land itself is changed, until the sky is emptied, until the beast is tired. This one may last many hours, perhaps more." The aliens shivered at his words, for to them, even one more hour felt like death. Yet the human spoke without fear, as if he had already accepted the truth. The storm outside grew louder, waves of dust smashing against the shelter, the ropes pulling tight, the beams bending, the cloth snapping like sails. Yet still the structure held. The lantern light within flickered, but did not go out, casting a soft glow across frightened faces. The aliens stared at it, as if it were the heart of the shelter, steady and alive. They whispered that it must be the humans' will that kept it standing, though deep inside they knew it was his knowledge, not luck nor chance, but understanding earned from storms they had never imagined. Some of the aliens began to weep, quietly, shame filling their voices. They spoke of the domes, they had trusted the machines, they had praised the pride they had carried into this world. They remembered how they had laughed at the human, mocked his labor, called his work a joke, and now they realized that their laughter had been blind, their pride a trap that had led them into weakness, while the one they mocked had prepared for the truth they had refused to see. The human listened but said nothing. He only moved across the shelter, pressing knots, tightening ropes, reinforcing stones, every movement slow and careful, his silence heavy, yet filled with meaning. The aliens watched him with new eyes, no longer seeing weakness, no longer seeing foolishness. Now they saw patience, strength, and certainty, and though they could not yet say it aloud, respect began to grow like a fire in their hearts. The storm raged on hour after hour, the ground shaking, the wind howling, the dust cutting across the walls. The aliens clung to each other, afraid that at any moment everything would collapse. But each time they looked up, the shelter still stood. Each time they listened, the ropes still held. Each time they opened their eyes, the human was still there, moving calm, steady, tireless, like the storm itself, but on their side. One alien finally asked him, "Why do you help us after we mocked you, after we doubted you, after we laughed at your shelter?" The human paused, his hand resting on a beam, his face shadowed by the lantern light. He spoke softly, yet firmly, and said, Because survival is not a choice, it is a duty. If one falls, we all fall. If one survives, we all survive. Your laughter did not change my duty or doubt, did not change the storm. So I built what was needed. The aliens fell silent, for his words cut deep in there. Shame grew heavier, yet so did their respect. The long night stretched further, their bodies weak from hunger, their throats dry from dust, their minds filled with fear. Yet they endured because the shelter endured, because the human endured. They leaned against the walls, expecting collapse, but finding strength. They listened to the wind, expecting death, but hearing life in the steady creak of ropes and beams. Outside, the world was erased, the domes gone, the camp buried under mountains of dust, the machines silent, broken, crushed beneath the storm's endless weight. The storm showed no mercy, no care for pride, no respect for science. Only strength and patience could face it, and only one shelter had both. Only one builder had known how to prepare. The aliens began to whisper prayers, not to their machines, not to their science, but to the storm itself, asking it to pass, asking it to spare them, their voices small against the roar. But within the shelter, those prayers felt safe, carried by the steady walls and the steady man who had built them. At last, when the night felt eternal, when hope felt thin, the storm gave a new sound, a sound deeper than before, a long, slow rumble that shook the ground, not with fury, but with exhaustion. The wind howled still, but less sharp, less wild. The dust swirled still, but less thick, less endless. The aliens lifted their heads, their eyes wide. With hope, could it be? They asked, could it be ending? But the human only shook his head and said, not yet, but soon. His words gave them strength, not despair, for they had learned through the long night that his words were true. His silence was wisdom, his shelter was salvation. So if he said the storm would end soon, then they believed, and for the first time since the fury began, they closed their eyes, not in fear, but in trust, resting against the walls of the shelter, letting the sound of the storm become a song that promised survival. And though the storm raged still, though the night dragged on, they endured together inside the shelter, the one place the beast of nature could not break, the one place that proved the human had been right from the beginning. The night stretched like an endless shadow, yet slowly the roar outside began to change. The howls of the storm turned weaker, the pounding of the dust softened, the trembling of the earth faded. The aliens opened their eyes one by one, their bodies heavy, their breaths ragged, but their hearts beating with hope. They looked at the walls around them, still standing, swaying, yet unbroken, glowing faintly in the lantern light, and they knew that somehow, against all reason, they were alive. The human had not closed his eyes. He stood near the entrance, his hand resting on a beam, his gaze fixed on the shifting walls, as if he could read the language of the storm itself. The aliens watched him in silence, their voices caught in their throats, for they did not know what words could carry the weight of what they felt: shame, respect, gratitude, all mixing together like fire and dust. The storm outside gave one last scream, a cry of anger like a beast denied its prey. Then silence, deep, heavy silence, filled the land. The aliens flinched at the sudden stillness, their ears ringing, their hearts racing. The silence was louder than the storm, for it meant one thing: the beast was gone. The human stepped to the door, his hand lifting the cloth slowly, carefully, as if the world outside might still bite. The aliens leaned forward, their eyes wide, their breath sharp, as the first sliver of light broke through the darkness, a pale, golden glow, soft and trembling, yet stronger than all the machines they had built. The storm had passed, the sun had returned, the world was reborn. But the sight outside was not the same as before. Where once there had been domes shining and tall, now there was only ruined, broken metal, shattered glass, half-buried machines, swallowed by dunes of red dust. The land had changed into an ocean of sand, hills rising where ground once was, valleys carved by the storm's claws. Nothing was left of the camp, nothing but silence. The aliens stepped out slowly, their feet sinking into soft sand, their eyes wide, their bodies weak from the long night. They looked around, their voices trembling. As they spoke of what they saw, they whispered that the storm had taken everything: their homes, their tools, their pride, all erased in one endless night. Yet behind them the human shelter still stood, its ropes stretched tight, its beams scarred but unbroken, its cloth torn yet alive. It swayed gently in the wind like a survivor, proud and strong. The aliens turned to it, their hearts struck with awe, for they realized in that moment what they had doubted, mocked, and laughed at had become the only truth that had saved them. One alien fell to his knees, the dust rising around him, his hands digging into the sand, his voice breaking. As he cried out, we laughed at him. We called him foolish. We thought his work was weakness. But his shelter stands while all ours lie broken. Another alien spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. He built with wisdom. We built with pride. And pride has no place against the power of nature. The human said nothing. He only walked out onto the dunes, his eyes scanning the horizon, his face unreadable. He lifted a handful of sand and let it fall through his fingers, the dust carried away by the morning breeze. He spoke finally, his words slow and steady. The storm will come again, not today, not tomorrow, but one day it will return, and if we do not learn, we will fall again. The aliens bowed their heads. They knew he was right. They had trusted their machines, their science, their domes, but none of it had mattered in the face of the storm. What had saved them was not technology, but understanding, patience, humility, and the will to survive, and those things the human carried in his hands and heart while they had left them behind. Slowly they gathered near him, their eyes filled with respect. One of them spoke with trembling voice, saying, "Human, we owe you our lives, we owe you our survival. We cannot undo our laughter, we cannot erase our doubt, but we can learn from you. If you will teach us." His words broke the silence like water breaking stone. The others nodded their voices, joining, and they asked the human to share his knowledge, to show them how to build not just with strength, but with wisdom. The human looked at them, his gaze steady, his silence long. Then he nodded once and said, "If you wish to live here, you must live with the land. Not against it you must bend. When the storm bends, you must stand. When the storm passes, you must build not for pride, but for survival. Only then will the land allow you to remain." His voice carried across the dunes like a command, not of force, but of truth. The aliens listened, and for the first time, they understood. They saw the world not as a place to conquer, but as a place to endure. They saw the storm not as an enemy, but as a teacher. They saw the human not as a fool, but as a guide, and they swore in their hearts to follow this path, to build shelters that breathed like the wind, that swayed like trees, that survived like the man who had saved them. The sun climbed higher, burning away the dust, painting the land in gold. The ruins of the domes glittered like broken glass, half buried in red sand, a memory of pride lost. But the human shelter still stood strong against the horizon, a promise of life. The aliens gathered near it, their hands working already to repair the cloth, to strengthen the ropes, to learn what they had once mocked. As they worked, the human watched, his eyes steady, his hands ready to guide. But he knew the storm had already taught the greatest lesson, and they would never laugh again at what they did not understand. The shelter had become more than walls, more than beams. It had become a symbol of survival, a reminder that wisdom is greater than pride, that patience is stronger than arrogance, and that even in the face of endless storms, the will to endure will always stand. The aliens looked at the horizon, dust still drifting in the air, though the storm had passed, its shadow still lingered, and they knew the land would test them again one day. But now they were not afraid. Now they had a guide. Now they had learned, and when the next storm came, they would be ready. They would stand together with the human, with his shelter, with his wisdom. The storm had taken their domes, their pride, their arrogance, but it had given them something greater. It had given them respect for the human and for the power of survival itself. And as the wind whispered across the dunes, carrying the last breath of the storm into the sky, they knew they would never forget the night they doubted the human shelter until nature showed its power.